Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Defence Eye podcast. We're devoting this edition to the Defence Investment Plan, which of course dropped on June 30th, yesterday. So we're still in the afterglow of the excitement of the announcement, the Prime Minister's speech at Malloy Aeronautics in Maidenhead, the Defence Secretary's announcement in the House of Commons, and lots of excitement after that. Now, in the wake of the announcement, there's lots of analysis, lots of commentary, and we're going to add to that with our own distinctive spin on events. It's been a very dynamic past maybe 4 or 5 days in the build-up to the event, the actual event itself, and what's happened after it. I mean, my takeaway is we hadn't seen the end of it. There's more to come as the whole thing unfolds. Francis, what do you think so far?
Well, a view, and I've heard this from other people who've said 16, 18 months, and this is what we get. Could there not have been something slightly more coherent, something which has a journey and saying, right, we are here, we need to be here, and we have to go through these stages? Again, comments generally, people saying it is an assembly of random announcements. Half of them we knew already, but they're being paraded as new. And it's just not very coherent. And this is meant to be the flesh on the bones of the Strategic Defence Review. And most people saying it's not really that at all. We were promised by John Healey, he's no longer Secretary of State for Defence, that the Defence Investment Plan was going to be the new Defence Equipment Plan. So you were going to have the indicative figures for spends in capability areas, combat air support, ships, submarines, you name it. But also in the equipment plan, you had indicative spends by command. Well, we don't have any of that worth the name. Also, the equipment plan, again, as promised by John Healey, but also by the still Minister for Readiness and Defence Industry, Luke Pollard, who's still in post, it was going to be a 10-year document. Well, this is not a 10-year document. It stretches just about out to 5 years, but most of the control totals, it's 3 years, just about 4. So to then try and claim we have now given industry the horizon for industry to invest and so forth. No, they haven't.
I mean, it's also from sort of my take on it is that there are, lots of these programs are just, the super tankers. They are just in there and they're keeping going and they're just topping them up and just keeping going. But the sort of new programs don't seem to get any kind of early delivery. They all seem to be couched as we will have the combat air demonstrator flying by 2030. That doesn't mean it's in service. And the same for lots of the naval robot ships. They're all past 2030. So that the immediacy of the crisis we're supposed to be in at the moment, the wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, the danger, immediate danger, it seems to be not being addressed.
Absolutely. And I would say there is an even more glaring example of this lack of urgency. The 6 or maybe more energetics and munitions factories. Now, this was originally a plan announced by the previous Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. I was nearly having to say the previous but one Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, in April 2024, where he announced 6 energetics, that's explosives and propellants and stuff like that, and munitions factories. And the back briefing at the time was the first of these would be in service at the tail end of this year. So about 18 to 20 months from flash to bang to seeing an always-on production of energetics, propellants, explosives, and then munitions. Well, we're now having in the document 6 or more to be in operation by 2030. And you're going, hang on a second, this thing of we could be at war with Russia by 2029-30, and the factories that would fuel our armed forces are largely not going to be generating anything until this so-called war has started. So this is one of the many disconnects in DIP. And you just get the impression there was not someone saying, right, have you worked out the coherence with this and this? Have you worked out how that is going to match with this? It does not come over in the document at all.
I mean, the biggest sort of incoherence that I spotted in the whole document, and it runs through the whole thing, is, yes, you had this big message about drone warfare, autonomy, and, for example, in the Royal Navy domain, reducing the number of ships that the Royal Navy, crewed warships that the Royal Navy will have. Yet, the DIP doesn't take that to its logical conclusion that you actually need fewer sailors, and you need fewer dockyards, and you need fewer married quarters for the sailors, and you need fewer repair dry docks. The whole sort of savings that you can get from having a uncrewed navy are not
Well,
addressed.
and let's take that on to Army and the Royal Air Force. Is the current shape of the Army, in terms of the infantry, the cavalry, the artillery, whatever, right for this new drone force? Or actually, are we going to see an enhanced role for the REME, Royal Electrical Mechanical Engineers? Because these drones will need tuning, reprogramming, whatever. Or will the Royal Signals become much more of, as it were, a combat arm rather than a combat support arm? And bearing in mind, they were saying about the Defence Investment Plan, no, it's not just about toys. It's the whole picture. It's infrastructure. It's training. It's the truth. Yeah, the whole lot, personnel. Like you, I don't come away with the impression that there is that rationale. People have joined the dots. Good old DLODs, defence lines of development, which you're meant to consider. When you're buying equipment, you are meant to consider personnel, training, doctrine, logistics, infrastructure. It's not coming through. It looks like it was more written by a series of spin doctors than it was written by, say, the Chief of Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Rich Knighton. Of course, he played a role in it, but you get the impression the people who were really bringing it together were going, what can we spin? What can we get as a really good press release? And so that's why there is a lack of coherence.
I mean, how this thing unfolds over the next months and year or so, without that kind of information, without that coherence, we are going to have our armed forces scrabbling to try and react and try and recast their force structure, their personnel numbers. For example, we have a couple of announcements about the retirement of helicopters and aircraft, and that has major implications for the closure of bases. So they're going to retire the Army Wildcat and 2027 and potentially replace the Navy Wildcat with a robot drone air vehicle by 2035. So what does that mean for the footprint of the Fleet Air Arm? Yeovilton sounds like it's going to be empty. They're going to get rid of a load of Chinooks. What does that mean for the RAF? They're going to buy the NMH. Is that going to be part of the Army or the RAF? We don't know. So,
and yeah, as you said, another incoherence. I suppose what was really quite head scratching about the decision to retire the Army Wildcats early was I know, Tim, you and I have both heard through various sources, right, originally when the decision to have a common helicopter with the Navy was announced, the Army was all, oh, God, no, we don't want to touch it, it's ridiculous. They, from reports I've had, have grown to love it and regard it as an incredibly flexible asset. Now, in some of the briefings and also in the document, well, aviation on the battlefield is no longer secure and safe, so that's why we're getting rid of it. But actually, I would suggest that Wildcat is probably a better platform for a drone deployment than an Apache is, not least because the intellectual property and the design, engineering, whatever, are all resident in Britain. Whereas if we want to integrate our British, helicopter-launched drones onto the Apache, you have to do it through the US, and that's just going to cost a fortune.
I mean, and also the big gap in the document was our favourite subject, home defence, that complete vacuum and lack of any detail on how the armed forces are going to contribute to home defence. No mention whatsoever. Well, throwaway mentions, but no details.
And one specific on there, when talking about integrated air and missile defence. Yes, we're going to spend money, up to 2030. Yeah, on a new command centre, a couple of new radars, and some new sort of telephone lines. In terms of effectors, missiles for integrated air and missile defence, no mention of when any of that will be bought. And we both know from conversations we've had, we've been told nothing until the mid 2030s. So in that respect, the UK is defenceless. And yet, there's again the throwaway line about Typhoons and F-35s backed by Voyagers are part of the mix. Yeah, not against ballistic missiles, they aren't. So stop trying to claim that that is our front line against some of the most pressing threats against the UK homeland. I don't think anyway we have enough to. If you had a Russian-style drone swarm fired at the UK, do we even have enough aircraft available to cope with it? I doubt it. I will note that they have said they will, was it double the number of Skysaver systems? But that would be, well, it was 5 in the original order, and it was 7 in the top-up last year. So they'll take it to 24, which is notionally 1 regiment.
Which is still not very many. Now, this, of course, all these questions are all flowing around, and people wondering what's going to happen. I mean, the big elephant in the room has to be, you heard yesterday that both the Prime Minister and Dan Jarvis, the Defence Secretary, were both asked openly in the press conference and in the House of Commons, has the future Prime Minister signed this off? And the form of words were very common. Both Starmer and Jarvis used the phrase, "This plan is so great, which Prime Minister wouldn't agree with it?" Which led the question led you to think, well, maybe they hasn't signed it off.
And I would add to that the fact that the main headline about the Defence Investment Plan this morning has been that of the so-called 15 billion, 5 billion, well, 4.7 of that is still to be decided in the next comprehensive spending round. If I'm Andy Berman, even if I had been shown the document as was published, and my guys had read it and gone, yeah, Andy, I think we're okay with this. My one would be, hang on, you didn't show me that document or that document. So basically I signed off on an incomplete understanding. So I would suspect it's not just wriggle room. I doubt he will cut defence. He'd be a fool if he did. But I certainly think he can look back at some of the planned spending and some of the assumptions, and I think he can go, well, sorry, that one's wrong. Going to change that one. Don't like that one. Does this mean more instability? Well, if a third of the money to cover the next 4 years, the delta, I'll come on to this issue, the spending delta, in a second. If a third of that is yet to be found, there's also a requirement for 10.7 billion of savings. Is that part of the 15 billion, or is this only achievable if the MOD say it's 10.7? We don't know, because the data as provided by the MOD and Treasury is completely inconclusive. There is so much uncertainty there that I return. The DIP and SDR were meant to give certainty to industry, so industry could plan a smooth out the work streams, bring down costs. I don't see how they're going to do it on the basis of what was published yesterday. And just coming back to some of the cash figures, what is supremely disingenuous, and I'm being nice, I'll come and use a word beginning with the letter L in a second, is this thing of we are investing 298 billion. We're investing 298 billion to modernize the armed forces. That includes pay. The biggest single portion of that, 297. So basically what they're saying is, because how does any normal human understand investment? It's, you're buying a new car, or you're buying new ships for the Royal Navy, you're buying new aircraft for the RAF. And yes, it's very good. The DIP, will give credit. They have got a lot of infrastructure in there, which we can return to, which is vital. But to start claiming that things like pay and feeding RAF police dogs is investment in modernising the armed forces, come off it.
I mean, the figure I think is something like £78 billion goes on people and veterans, which is, out of 300-ish is, almost a quarter of the budget.
And I know the personnel are important. I'm not saying they're not. All I'm saying is it is supremely disingenuous to claim that the budget for modernising the armed forces is 298 billion. It isn't. Automatically, if you feel you have to lie about what you're spending, yes, lie, it means you're not very confident about what you're trying to sell. If there's the very old saying, a good wine needs no bush. In other words, if you've got a good wine, you don't have to add things to it to make it drinkable. It's perfectly good as it is. The spin here shows that they are not confident in this document.
I mean, we have, as you say, probably a few weeks of uncertainty until the new Prime Minister takes over. Then we'll be into a budget round for the new Prime Minister to make, and the new Chancellor to make their mark on the government agenda for the next 2 years, or perhaps beyond that. This is going to be their election-winning budget, the one that has to set the tone. This is probably November, so they're going to make these decisions around mid-October-ish, and that's the point where they're going to go back to the Ministry of Defence and say, hey guys, we're not going to give you any money. You got 300 billion or whatever it is, 390. Isn't that enough? I mean, it's the biggest ever budget settlement the Ministry of Defence has ever had, and they're going to say, come on, guys, you must be able to find this money somewhere in this budget to do this, this drone budget. You must be able to find that from within your organisation. Why do you
Well,
need a top
well,
up out of that 300 billion quid? Is there not a deeper penetrating look at where this money is actually spent before you actually ask for any more?
absolutely agree, Tim. And I'll give two answers, and they're not the only two answers. They're just two. One is that work I've done and have had verified through a number of sources. The MOD is very inefficient when it comes to procurement. And when you compare the performance of Abbey Wood and services with their equivalents in France and Italy, and before anyone does you can't compare with anyone else, France has nuclear deterrent like we do. Two nuclear deterrents. They have an air-launched one as well. So you can do like for like, and you can do a like for like with Italy because we have a DNO, Defence Nuclear Organisation, now Defence Nuclear Enterprise. You can just strip that out. The Italians spend about 75% of what we do on procurement, and they demonstrably get far more than we do. And the numbers are absolutely conclusive. The French spend about 85, maybe 90% of what we do. And again, you can say they get more ships, they get more fighters, they get more AFEs, they get more munitions. And someone has got to start working out why, when there is such evidence of this, that we're still continuing with a system that is patently not delivering. It really, really isn't. But the second point, and as I say, these are not the only 2 points. I wrote something, oh God, if I say a year ago, it was 2 years ago. I think it was just about the time that General Rowley Walker came into post. And I noted, and this is before everything became drone this, drone that. But I just pointed out that looking at the equipment plan at the time, which had seen the Army equipment plan had seen a couple of, increases. So it was not brilliant, but it was still healthier than it had been. The problem is that about 90% of that equipment program to 2033 was obligated through Challenger 3, Ajax, Boxer, and a few other programs. Basically, even if some of the money was still in the uncommitted column, you knew it had to be committed because you started adding things up. Now, I'm told that he was shown that article, and it was that's absolutely right. At the Land Warfare Conference, the RUSI Land Warfare Conference last week, the CGS said in his speech, at the moment, the 20%, the legacy systems, the heavy metal, account for over 50% of the, well over 50% of the Army procurement spend. And he wants, by 2030, to see 50% going on the attritable and the disposable drones. Unless you cancel some of the big programs or get a massive increase in funding, that's not going to happen. And so, and I think the same is going to be true of the other services. How do you suddenly fit these new crewed combat vessels into the naval pipeline when you are still building ones and 6s? And, both our main yards are going to be busy until 2032. You need to plan this. And, I'm sure someone will say, oh, we have it in hand. Well, I think we need to have a little bit more evidence that people are thinking about this. And sorry, coming back to a point on personnel bases and so forth. If you are going for this collaborative aircraft for use with Typhoon and possibly F-35, I assume you're not going to leave them out on the pan as an airbase. Has someone considered about the hangarage you are going to need because the whole point about the CCAs is mass. So your Typhoon squadron may only be 12 aircraft, but don't worry, we will have 30 CCAs. Has anyone assessed whether there is enough hangarage around the RAF estate for all of these? Bearing in mind, one of the things that killed Watchkeeper was that it wasn't allowed to fly outside Salisbury Plain and then a single corridor to Park Aberporth in southwest Wales. Where are the CCAs going to fly?
Good point. I mean, and also, the CCAs, they have this sort of idea that they're going to be crated up and only deployed in time of war, and the pilots will train on emulated inputs into their cockpits during exercises, so they won't actually need to fly them. But as you said, that brings a question of storage, but also transportation. Does the RAF have enough trucks to move these things around, or transport planes to fly them around when the balloon goes up?
And do they have the right numbers of staff to do the assembling of the CCAs and testing them before they're put in combat. And I would actually then just slightly question, do you actually want them on the line as the balloon starts going up? Or do you want people literally opening a crate which says, welcome to your collaborative combat aircraft. With careful assembly and use, you can enjoy this for many years to come. Do you want to be reading the IKEA instructions to assemble it, literally as drones are heading towards the UK? Again, this is why um, there are so many devils in the detail in DIP. Lots of high level, we're going to buy this, this, this. Yes, to what end, to what effect? And this is where there is not, from what I can see, coherent thought.
In terms of the army, they're obviously moving to this drone agenda as well, but a lot of their infrastructure and support costs are set in their big contracts with Babcock and all the other suppliers to maintain and repair their armoured vehicle fleets. And it's quite interesting when you look at those tables that they produce in the DIP and previous equipment plans. It doesn't seem to be very much money is spent on actually buying these vehicles and these things. But then you have huge tails of support costs. So, for example, we have Ajax, which they've spent £5 billion over the past decade, but they've just signed up to £1.8 billion of support costs for the next 5 years. So you wonder, is there not scope for efficiency in these contracts and saving money? For example, the British Army has major contracts with Babcock for whole fleet management, and huge numbers of 80% of the vehicles are parked up. They're not actually used, and Babcock are paid to repair them and keep them ready to go if the balloon goes up. But is there not a case for moving that cost into the field army, delivering all those vehicles back to the units, and you increase the size of the REMI and they fix them up on a day-by-day basis, but you also then increase readiness in that you have an army that has its full complement of vehicles and weapons and artillery ready to go, rather than a huge investment in whole fleet management with private sector contractors who are paid just to store things, rather than REMI engineers who are paid to have their vehicles ready to go in the tank park.
And again, a very good question. And it is interesting that there doesn't seem any, we're both probably on our third or fourth read of the DIP. There doesn't seem to be any particular discussion of this type of thing. Now, if you're talking about warship repair and support, the idea you will bring that back into the Royal Navy, that ship sailed a long time ago. The Royal Navy is just not set up to do that type of work. And I think they will have lost the skills and expertise. Unless you nationalise Devonport and Portsmouth, forget it. But for the army side, yes, the changing flange widgets and filters on a Warrior is core REMI business. So you'd think they would be more than capable of looking after. I won't say I'm a fan of whole fleet management. I was covering it when it was brought into operation, and I would say it has ended up a bit like the charge of the Light Brigade. The message was actually to go to the right to stop the Russians taking away some captured artillery, but instead they went straight down the valley. And so it was the misinterpretation. Whole fleet management was meant to increase availability, lower costs, and also get rid of inefficiencies. But the problem is it ended up just being about cost. And so, yes, we've had troops often exercising far less on equipment. Whole fleet management, I would say the original intention was certainly very honest and noble. The implementation has been perhaps less effective than had been thought.
So looking forward to the arrival of the new Prime Minister a few weeks' time, how do you think this revisit, because there really is going to be a revisit of this, will play out over the next weeks or months until that budget announcement in November, where some crunch decisions will be made about how this thing goes forward?
Well, although he has made some statements and comments relating to security and defence, the main part of, let's call it, the Burnham Manifesto is not based in and around defence. I would caution, as would you, I'm sure, if he ignores defence, it will come back and bite him badly. Something will happen somewhere. one of the problems I think he had to understand is that our European allies are getting very worried about the UK's defence capabilities, and heard there was a NATO conference last week where not quite speaker after speaker, but a lot of the speakers were saying the UK at the moment is fading into strategic irrelevance in NATO, and actually might even fade into to be a strategic liability. So that is the canvas on which he is going to be having to work. We have allies who are spending, relative to their GDP and so forth, far more than we are. And they have put it before their parliaments plans to get to 3.5% GDP. All the ones I've looked at, they're not done on the back of the fag packet. No, they are very clear exactly how they get from where they are to where they need to be. And in certain cases, it's not 3.5% of GDP on defence by 2035. A lot of the Eastern European countries and the Baltic states are going to be there in the very early 20s. And as we know, there had been a commitment to get to 3% of GDP by 2029-30, and now it's a commitment to 2.7%. So at the heart of DIP, it's not expectations being lowered. It's just no one is that interested in the current government in matching words with deeds. And more and more people are talking about the so-called say-do gap. We say one thing, we say we're a global leader. The Prime Minister yesterday was saying, look, the two big alliances in the heart of NATO, both of them were started by Britain because we are the leaders. Our allies are saying, yeah, and then as soon as the going gets tough, we don't see anything from the UK. So we might have set up the Joint Expeditionary Force of the northern NATO nations, the Baltic states and so forth. Our JEF allies look at our contributions to the JEF and go, it's pretty pathetic. You talk the talk, but you don't walk the walk.
The big thing from Andy Burnham's speech on Monday was about the Number 10 North driving economic regeneration in left behind communities. And he specifically mentioned as one of the areas where he wanted to drive investment in UK industry was defence. So maybe there is going to be a MOD North within this organisation that will become the advocate for the British defence industry, because we've heard it over the years about the predication for the armed services to buy American stuff. And if the new Prime Minister is going to be convinced in any way that more money or the current money needs to be kept spending on defence, the thing that will tick his box is it's made near Wigan. That is the thing that will, or wherever it is in outside London, or outside the southeast of England, that is the thing that will tick the box.
Yeah. And I would say, especially as we were saying earlier, the likelihood that if Andy Burnham had signed off on DIP, it was not DIP in all its areas, because he just simply wasn't shown everything. I think one area he can show he's serious about, and he has said, but also so is the Defence Readiness and Defence Industry Minister, Luke Pollard. They have both said British money into British factories for British jobs. And I think there's one way, which, by the way, you can find $2.5 billion of savings with this one. We don't go ahead with the F-35A order. Pathetically small number of aircraft. We're going to have to buy a whole new set of infrastructure to support them. There was no clamour from NATO for us to do the tactical nuclear role. As NATO has pointed out, we have put Trident, a strategic deterrent, at the disposal of NATO. And the NATO people I've spoken to have said, why are you doing this tactical nuclear stuff? Thanks, but there's other stuff we can spend your money on. So if Andy Burnham wanted to show that British money, British factories, British jobs, he would cancel 35A. It's not on contract. So and the Americans will get angry. Anyone notice that in the last couple of days, President Trump, because of the likely digital tax, has said he will slap 100% tariff on all British goods going to the United States? In other words, he's ripped up the tariff agreement he signed with Keir Starmer last year. Trying to please President Trump is a waste of time, and the MOD does not have in its mandate a requirement to increase profit margins and share dividends of US defence primes.
So the conclusion has to be that the story's not over. We're going to be talking about this for many weeks or months, and keep tuned for the further editions of the Defence Eye podcast.